very happy to have Bram Sizoo here this week. He's a professor by special appointment here at the UvA. He specializes in the intersection of psychopathology and radicalization, also extremist violence and terrorism. And he investigates how psychological processes and psychiatric problems influence radicalization from a clinical psychology perspective, looking into both protective and provoking factors. And today he'll give a talk on the clinical psychology of radicalization.
Exactly. Thank you very much for the introduction. I think I'll remain seated because it's a bit silly to stand up, and then I'm also not in view. Maybe I should explain what I do apart from the 2 days of this special appointment here at the UvA. So it's for 2 days. One day is at the UvA, it's teaching and research, and the other day is sort of promoting the knowledge about the intersection of clinical psychology and radicalization in the security domain. So that means police, intelligence services, explain to them about the interrelationship between psychology. So that's the second day. And that leaves 3 days in a working week. So there's also 2 days I work for the central unit of the Dutch police in a special team. And this team deals with people who send disturbing communications to principals, ministers, politicians, royalties, ambassadors, threatening or expressing their love in such a way that it might lead to a disrupting incident. And if these people, if there's a suspicion of psychopathology, they end up in our team, and we try to guide them towards care. So instead of prosecuting them, sometimes they haven't done anything which is prosecutable, but they're sort of working their way into prosecution. Instead, we try to get them into care, and by doing that, reduce the risk. So I think it's great that the police has got this sort of focus on getting people into care instead of prison. That was the reason why I mentioned that, was that in this team, we also saw fixated individuals who had a fixation on radicalization. And there was also an intersection with psychiatric problems. So that sort of kindled the interest in the subject, and that led to this special appointment. If there are any questions, please interrupt, because we're a small group, and I hope, Gustavo, you will manage the online questions.
There's now about 4 people online. So yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is to look at the issue, what drives an extremist. So not so much on extremism or radicalization or terrorism itself, but on the subjects behind the problem, so to say. First of all, we'll look at 4 misconceptions. Then we look back at research up to now. Then we're going to have a look at the status quo, the problem is at this moment, and where we stand in this. And then we will be looking ahead at the research which I plan to do, because the appointment was only very recently in December. So I'm still working on a research program. Okay, so the chair of clinical psychology radicalization, basically, you see in the center there's this guy, and he picks a terrorist, and around him there's a lot of discussion about terrorism, about the terrorist. Nobody really talks to a terrorist, but they talk about it. So, and the idea is, of course, the big puzzle is what led to this guy waving an AK-47, what happened in between, because he started off as a nice youngster. So that's my interest, and that's really where the chair is focused, sort of right in the middle, to research that development, that dynamic. So I think there are lots of misconceptions, but I'd like to highlight a few misconceptions. So in quotes, the people could say, well, the question what drives an extremist is less important. We should look at, how can we prevent extremism? How can we prevent a terror attack? No matter who does it, we don't care. They're all evil, just try to prevent it. I think it's very important to focus on the people behind extremism and terrorism, because once you understand what makes them tick, which perhaps not the right word, but which makes them which motivates them. If you understand the dynamics, then you might also be able, in the trajectory which leads up to extremism, to intervene. So I think asking the question what drives an extremism is extremely important. And the second misconception is that radicalization always leads to extremism and terrorism. There's a reason why this why radicalization is nowadays almost undetachably linked to extremism and terrorism. In 2004, there was the attack on Atocha in Madrid, Al-Qaeda attack. It was a dreadful attack on a train station and also other places in Madrid. And the European Commission after that said, well, this should never really happen again. We must focus on this issue of radicalization. That's the first time that radicalization was mentioned in the context of terrorism and extremism. Since then, radicalization has become linked to extremism and terrorism in a way that it cannot be detached anymore. So if you talk about radicalization, people think of extremism and terrorism. Whereas the hypothesis is that radicalization is a general process leading up to perhaps extremism and terrorism, but it could also lead to many other outcomes. We'll talk about that later. So it's a more general thing. So it's not exclusively linked to extremism and terrorism. Now, in the Netherlands, we adopt definitions of extremism and terrorism, which are formulated by the NCTV, the National Coordinator for Terrorism Prevention and Security, NCTV. And in the definitions of the ICTV, of the NCTV, ideology is a base of extremism and terrorism. Whereas terrorism is the actual committing a violent act directed against people or objects. Extremism is the readiness to commit an act. So it's more the phase preceding terrorism. But both, according to the definition, have to be inspired by ideological motivation. Now, this is typically policy-based language, because what is ideological motivation? What's an ideology? What's the motivation? Is the motivation the reasoning after the event, the justification of what you've done? That can be called a motivation. Or is the motivation, excuse me, is the motivation the more in-depth psychological precursor of the action? So motivation it has got different interpretations. And ideology is defined as worldview, which doesn't help much, because what is worldview? Does the worldview mean that it has to be shared by many other people, or can it also be a very personalized worldview? So all these questions related to the definitions of terrorism and extremism lead to further questions, which does not make the issue much clearer. Then there's also some misconceptions about the name of the chair. The chair is Clinical Psychology of Radicalisation. So I've been asked by journalists, so does that mean that radicalization is a psychiatric disorder which can be treated? No, it's not. Terrorism and extremism are not disorders, and they're not in need of clinical psychology or psychiatry. People with mental health problems are potential terrorists. That's also a misconception, and that's reversing things. So this is a typical result from a base rate problem, where in a sample of terrorists, for example, lone actors, you see a certain percentage of people with mental health problems. And invariably what you see in policy domain is that this is looked at like, wow, we've got 119. Now this is a sample from Paul Gill's study. We got a sample of 119 lone actors, Northern Europe and or Europe and Northern America, and 30% of them had mental health problems. Now we know where we should focus our prevention. It's in the mental health care. So off they go to mental health care and they train all mental health professionals in radicalization. And that is a base rate problem because the prevalence, of course, the prevalences vary greatly. And the third misconception in this row is we only need clinical psychology to prevent extremism and terrorism. Of course, that's not true. It is one way to look at it. But we need to, it really is in need of a multidisciplinary approach. Okay, so having dealt with the misconceptions, if we very briefly look at the research, then what we can see is that up to the 1990s, the research was of, could say, inferior quality. There were very small samples, professionals with a non-psychological background made conclusions that were related to the psychological profile of terrorists, all sorts of things. So the speculation on psychological causes and profiles were done by non-clinicians, and there was poor methodology. Viktorov did a meta-analysis in 2005, and he concluded that most of the research up to the 1990s were subjective interpretations of anecdotal observations, which is pretty harsh. He also highlights one example, which is hilarious. That was a German researcher who had talked to a number of terrorists in Germany in, I think it was the 70s or the 80s. And in his paper, he said, well, and also I have noticed that many of them have tattoos. Now, this is a sort of, and I think that's what Viktorov is referring to, anecdotal observations. Now, later research, as from the sort of mid-1990s, 2000, you see a shift where the focus is no longer on trying to find the profile of the terrorist, which was up to then the sort of aim, but rather the focus is more on the pathways leading up to an act of terrorism. There was still a number, and there still are a number of approaches to research. For example, the psychosocial model, very famous, is the staircase model of Mogadam, which generally says that there are 5 stages going from everything's okay to committing an attack, and there are 5 floors, and as you climb up the stairs, you slowly climb up to the stage, to the 5th floor, where the attack is committed. And of course, that model greatly reduces the complexity of what we see. And also we see that these models can be misinterpreted by, for example, police officers. Because if somebody is found to look on internet for terrorist-related issues, the conclusion could be drawn, oh, well, he is on Mogadam's scale. He's only on the 2nd floor, so we can sit back, because before he commits an attack on the 5th floor, we've still got plenty of time. Whereas in practice, we know that these 5 stages, you could distinguish these 5 stages, but they're certainly not sequential, and people may skip floors or go back. So it's an interesting model, but you can't translate it to practice as it is sometimes done. There's another issue of retrospective mining of risk factors by looking back. So in general, what happens is that when an attack has occurred, people look back at what might have influenced the attack. And we call that mining of risk factors. The only problem is that risk factors are then become detached from the original context. So, for example, if somebody has committed an attack and it's found that a few months before the attack, his relationship went wrong. It can be easily concluded that a breakup in a relationship is a risk factor for an attack. Now, this is simplifying things. Of course, you can't translate that to the general situation. It is very context dependent. So the problem with risk factors is that they have lost the original context. And also what you still see in papers is that there's a certain causality, whereas there's only, we should really speak of associations. Is that me? I hope not. Okay, so and the base rate fallacy I already mentioned. So these are some methodological issues in research which lead to wrong conclusions. Now, population studies are, of course, interesting because you can reach large numbers. The problem is that you cannot generalize the findings from population studies to predicting terrorist attacks. For example, Bettina Rottweiler in London with UCL did a study on the relationship between aggressive ideas about extremist violence and conspiracy thinking. And she found an association, a relationship. And what you see in literature, quoting her, is that this is wrongly interpreted as a causal relationship, which is, of course, not. So these are the population studies. And then there's something specific about psychiatric disorders. These seem to be very popular in terrorism research, that psychiatric disorders are sort of looked at, and then in a paper you see the prevalences of psychiatric disorders. And for example, what I just mentioned in the sample of, in this cohort of 119 lone actors, the prevalence of psychiatric disorders was 33%. Now, as a clinician, that doesn't say anything, because having a psychiatric disorder does not mean that it is also clinically manifest. So as we sit here and as you sit there online, you might have a psychiatric disorder, but not be troubled by it at this moment. So having the fact that a diagnosis has been made has absolutely no direct relationship to terrorism, to the pathway to terrorism. So you really need to look at, if there is a relationship, in what way did the psychiatric disorder influence the pathway to terrorism. We'll see some video material later on where I can illustrate this. Then also another problem is that if there is a relationship between a psychiatric disorder and the pathway to extremist violence, the relationship can also be bidirectional. So for example, if somebody has a depression, you could say, okay, if the depression has a relationship with a pathway to extremist violence, it can work both ways. Somebody can be so depressed that there's absolutely no hope for the future, and he's given up everything. He said, okay, well, I'm going to kill myself, and I'm going to take a lot of people with me, and that's it. I'm going to really make my point there. But at the same time, depression can lead somebody to complete passive situation where he's not able to do anything anymore, let alone commit an attack. The same for schizophrenia, same for medication. Medication can work both ways as well. So identifying the fact that somebody has a psychiatric disorder is not the final conclusion. You really need to look into the way it influences the pathway. Now, anthropological studies by Scott Tran and by Kruglanski are perhaps the most promising for future research, because they sit down with people in a conflict area and in an anthropological methodology try to explore the reasons and the motivations for people in that situation. So these are very valuable findings.
Can I ask how you define terrorism?
Well, if we stick to the definition of terrorism of the NCTV, then terrorism is using violence against people or objects for achieving a political goal. abbreviated.
Yeah, but is that also generally accepted definition in this?
Yeah, well, there are variations, but the political goal is generally in the definitions. The problem is that oh yes, and the other component, which I forgot to mention, is very important, is in order to destabilize democracy. So in Dutch, het ondermijnen van de democratie. So to destabilize democracy. Now that's an essential component as well. The thing is that there's a shift in what is being called terrorism. For example, the guys who committed the murder on Peter R. de Vries, they were charged with a terrorist offense, and it was it was not proven to be a terrorist offense, but now they go into appeal and it might well be proven. And that is a dramatic change in using terrorist offense in criminology, in law. Because up to then it was a real ideologically defined, but the ideology behind the murder of Peter R. de Vries is vague. I mean, what's the ideology? It's crime, organized crime. So you see that it's shifting. Also in public opinion, if there's a school shooting, for example, in America, well, for example, there are many school shootings in America, but after a school shooting, there's sort of general distress in the population, and people are inclined to say this is a terrorist attack because this is so bad, this is so shocking. It must be terrorism. So terrorism is in the general public seen as something extremely violent. So there are a lot of definition issues. Okay. So there are researchers who say that the studies into the relationship between psychology and extremist violence have not moved along much the past few years, and they've sort of stagnated. And the current trends are, as I said, that the ideological component is not so clear-cut as it was. We had jihadism, right-wing extremism, and it was all, life was simple. But now we have conspiracy thinkers. We have people who feel that they are sovereign and who want to give up their civil membership, their BSN, het burgerslaven-nummer. So, and this is really becoming a problem because there are more than 100,000 at the moment estimated in the Netherlands who feel that they no longer want to be part of the Dutch system. And they are developing groups to defend themselves, and they have weapon trainings. And so you see that there's it's still defensive, whereas in the United States it's offensive. So they're actively, there's active aggression against police officers, whereas in the Netherlands we haven't reached that stage yet, but there are trainings, and people have been arrested and put in prison for obtaining weapons and distributing weapons. So the ideology is becoming vague. Risk factors I talked about, and the prevalence figures I talked about, and then there's another problem, the scattered information among different stakeholders. Now, if I can't think of a very clear example, think, for example, of the incident at the Erasmus Universiteit. Sorry. Okay, I'll make my point first. At the Erasmus Universiteit, there was this guy who was a self-proclaimed person with Asperger's syndrome. He had affinity with incel community. He was known to be cruel against animals. He'd been convicted for that, and he was very angry. And at a certain stage, he killed his neighbor and her daughter, and they went to university and killed a university teacher. Now, in looking back, what happened, you see a pattern that people say, oh, but police knew about this, and mental health care knew about that, and the public prosecutor had this information, and they didn't communicate. So in general, that's a sort of accusation that's made after an attack. But if you look forward, then it's impossible to predict which bits of information should connect with which other bits of information because they're related. So it's difficult to determine when you should share information in order to prevent violence. Okay.
We also see it move away from the clear violence part of it, because like if we somewhat wrongly label non-political events as terrorist, we also somewhat wrongly label non-violent events as terrorist. Yeah. Specifically in the cybersphere, there's also something to.
Well, in the definition, terrorism is violence.
Okay.
And the problem is violence in the Netherlands, at least, is still regarded as physical violence, not psychological violence. Although in some cases of stalking, we have seen that the courts have accepted the fact that there's been a dramatic psychological violence. Okay, but that's only restricted to stalking cases. So terrorism is violence. Extremism can be violent or non-violent. So haatzaaien is hate mongering. Is that the word in English? That is also extremism. So it's not physical violence, but it is. That's your first question.
Yeah, so if we take away the violent aspect, then we can meet other definitions, but we can't meet the definition of terrorism. Okay, and then talk about preventative or like prediction models. Should we make these models if we could make them better? I mean, you're saying right now it's basically impossible to predict. I could imagine that it won't be technologically impossible to predict for much longer. Should we make these models? It's also something that you look into. Or at what point do we enter?
Yeah, I don't think we have reached a stage yet where we can put together a predictive model, because it's so the populations are heterogenic. I mean, talking about a terrorist, if you look at the function book of terrorists, you can be a bomb maker, you can be an accountant, you can drive the bus, there's all sorts of specializations which require different competences and different attitudes. So that is, and you can be alone or you can be in a group, varies a lot, or you can be jihadist or right-wing extremist. In other words, it's very heterogenic. So putting together a model to predict who will move from intentions to violence, using violence, is extremely difficult. I'll come into that a little bit later, and maybe that will answer your question. Well, I don't think it'll answer your question, but it will address your question. So the proposed strategies, which I think are worthwhile looking at, is to look at radicalization in a broader perspective. So instead of seeing radicalization as solely leading to extremism and terrorism, if we look at radicalization as sort of general precursor to extremism and terrorism, we might broaden the scope and understand how people move, and I'll demonstrate a little bit later on. We'll also, I think it's worthwhile to look at the psychological function of narratives. Now, narratives, I think, is a better word than ideologies, because ideologies still refer to sort of circumscribed, defined stories. Narratives are broader. Narratives also encompass the sovereign narrative and conspiracy thinking, even stalking, even organized crime, you could say, as a narrative. Now, the narratives have two components. There's sort of, I use the metaphor of underwater and above water. Above the water, you can see, you can hear, you can read about the narratives, but underwater, they have a function. And I'll illustrate that a little bit later on. Maybe the slide should be later. So I'll skip this now and we move on to the last bit, which is the inactive mind approach. Now, an active mind approach is a philosophical concept, an active mind, which I've tried to apply to radicalization studies. So what is an active mind? The traditional paradigm is that the cognition of this person on the left upper corner leads via radicalization to extremism, and it's influenced by risk factors. That's the traditional paradigm. Now, the inactive mind approach is different. It says, okay, we have an individual, and the individual interacts with the world around him. We all do. And in this interaction, the individual both influences the interaction and the interaction influences the individual. It changes. So it's a sort of, so instead of behavior being the result of predetermined algorithms, you can also influence the way you can influence behavior by this relationship, this circular relationship with the interaction. And at the same time, the interaction influences the world around us, and the world around us influences the interaction. So interaction is the central concept here. And people define the world around them. They have a perception of the world around them, which we call a niche construction. So the idea is, instead of us defining how the world of a certain person, what a world looks like for a certain person, instead we try to look from a phenomenological perspective at how that person perceives the world. And that can be different from what everybody else thinks, but it's important. Because in time, if you look on the timeline, that is how somebody moves, how we all move in the world with this continuously changing perception of the world around us. That's what we call the niche construction. And the niche construction is sort of the way you look at the world at a moment, at a certain stage. And this can be a very robust impression of the world, not changing much. You plan your life, you're confident about who you think you are, who you think the others are, or it can be very vulnerable and volatile. And in that case, the niche construction can be portrayed as a sort of rickety house. Now, narratives have the capacity of providing a scaffolding over the rickety niche construction. So if you feel insecure, for example, think of the Corona time. Many people felt insecure. They didn't know what was in it, what the future looked like. They didn't know whether we're going to be ill, whether they had many insecurities. What you see is that conspiracy theories provided a narrative scaffolding for their insecurity. So what happens is that there's sort of psychological makeup, which can be robust or can be very vulnerable. And along comes this narrative, either on internet or in real life, with above the water the text and the web content, but underwater a psychological function. And that psychological function might match at that time exactly what you need. So it's like a magnet, the two combined. And then you see that the narrative is embraced by an individual. And again, the video clip, which I'll show later on, of Dylan Roof will illustrate this, how he embraced the narrative, and it makes it more plausible why he did so. So the idea is that in this radicalization phase, the general psychological constructs like overvalued beliefs, salience attribution, a sense of belonging or embitterment, and these are just some examples. And then in this process of sense making of the world and consequent niche construction, that might lead to choosing a narrative scaffolding or embracing a narrative, which in this case leads to extremism. But as I said, there might be many other alternatives. A narrative scaffolding might lead to stalking, for example, or might lead to conspiracy thinking or joining an incel community. Or it might even lead to finding a partner who says, don't be silly, and let's sit together. So The idea is not to see radicalization as a sort of precursor to only extremism and terrorism, but to see it more in a general way, which is also hopeful for interventions. Okay, so I promised you this video clip. Now we tested it, so at home you should hear the sound as well. This is a very brief video clip of Dylan Roof, who committed an attack in a church in the US, where he killed, first he joined a prayer group, and then he stood up and got his weapon and subsequently executed the people of the prayer group, except for one woman whom he wanted to tell the story afterwards. The clip is sort of self-explanatory, and I'll go into it a little bit later to explain about why I think this is relevant in the context of what I've just said. Perhaps when you watch the clip, there's a short fragment where he is interrogated. I'd like to ask you to watch his behavior and his response in this very, very brief, it's not even a second. See what you notice. Well, there we go.
I did it. Who did what?
There's people shot? Yeah, he shot the pastor, he shot all the men, and the police come right away.
Okay, well, I mean, of course, the sound is dramatic as well, but even without the sound, the story is dramatic. Did you notice anything when he was interrogated? What was his response?
Yeah.
He laughed. Exactly. That's what the police officers also noted in their report. He laughed, and they saw this as a sort of disrespect for his victims. That's how they interpreted his laugh. Now, who was Dylan Roof? Now, this is exactly what happened. So after he committed the attack, people looked back and said, yeah, what on earth made him do this? I'm sorry, I am sorry, I forgot to translate this slide. Okay, so I'll go through it and improve your Dutch while we go on. So he had a number of psychiatric evaluations, and it was found out that in his youth, he was a sort of withdrawn youngster who wasn't able to make reciprocal contact. So his reciprocal social contact was very poor. He was only transmitting. He didn't see cause and result relationship. So he had difficulty looking at the result of what he was actually doing. He didn't understand social rules, and he had a very formal interpretation of language. So, for example, if you use a metaphor, he would interpret it literally. He had non-verbal problems. And his mother said to one of the psychiatrists, yes, if he's anxious, he starts giggling. Now that's exactly what you saw in the interrogation. So, but it was interpreted and put down in the records and also in the court procedure as sort of disrespect for his victims. He had fixated interests in Star Wars, which is okay, I suppose, but also in racism, which was a bit more iffish. And he had a very sensory, he was over, he was oversensitive to sensory input. So light, sound. There were two other observations that his verbal developmental level was at the age of 14 and his social emotional level was the age of 9. He was 21 years old, biological age. So you could say, okay, well, and then the diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder was made. So in light of what we saw in earlier research, the conclusion might be drawn, okay, autism is a risk factor for terrorism because this guy had autism. The question we should ask is what did autism have any relationship to the pathway to extremist violence, and if so, in what way? Now, the factors leading to the pathway of extremist violence were that after his primary school, which he did quite well, it was a small school in the village where he lived, he did quite well, had high marks. He went to secondary school, to high school, and it was a huge school, many children, many changes. He became an adolescent, and his peers started relationships with girls, boys with girls, or whatever. And he failed at attempts to find a girlfriend. So he became depressed. He became anxious. He didn't want to go to school anymore. He stayed at home, and of course he sat behind his computer and he came across conspiracy theories. Now his anxiousness was answered by adopting a conspiracy theory of which said that the aeroplanes which fly through the air, that we think we can see the exhaust fumes, but they're not exhaust fumes. The conspiracy theory says they're chemical trails. They're deliberately distributing chemicals, and these are harmful. So when he read that, he said, "Okay, now I understand why I'm anxious, because this is what's actually happening." Well, he came further into the rabbit hole. He joined right-wing extremist groups, and he was groomed into committing the attack. And the reason why he did it, he wrote that in the note to his parents. He said, "This is, I have to do it." And so the idea is that the function of the narrative which he adopted answered all his anxiety and all his anger and all his frustration, because the narrative was misogynist, which he thought was finally the answer to why he was not able to get a girlfriend. It answered his anxiety, it answered his depression, and it gave him a sense of purpose, which he'd never had before in his life. So he committed the attack. So he took the violence for granted. He wasn't a violent man. You saw him practicing in the garden, of course, but that's probably what people in America do more often. But he wasn't a violent youngster. He adopted the violence because he was part of the deal. I don't know.
And why a church?
Why?
Why a church?
A church, because it was a black community, and so it was, you had to preserve the white race, he was told. Okay, just one more video clip, also of a guy with autism, and it's 2 minutes, and then we can talk about it. At least, yeah.
Alone on a London Underground platform, Damon Smith is caught on CCTV priming his bomb to explode on the tube. It's inside a rucksack, and he's timed it to go off just after 11 a.m. Surrounded by passengers, he feigns interest in his book. Further down the line, he gets off, but he's abandoned the rucksack in the carriage and left the device packed with ball bearings to detonate. The rucksack was eventually spotted. North Greenwich Station was evacuated. Although parts of the bomb were viable, it failed to explode.
If it had detonated, it certainly would have endangered life. without a doubt would have caused mass casualties and certainly would have caused substantial damage to the underground system. He had an unhealthy interest in firearms and violence, particularly mass shootings in America. And although he was in possession of some IS material, we cannot prove his motivation or certainly his ideology. The tapes on.
Yeah, this was Damon Smith in a police interview. He has Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism.
Then I was in the tube. I realised I was going to Stratford,
Right.
and I thought it would be a good time to leave my bag for a prank.
A former friend witnessed his developing interest in extremist violence.
It was showing me videos of ISIS grabbing a knife and cutting off people's heads slowly. It was like, don't this look sort of fun and all that? I was like, no, it doesn't. It looks a bit wrong, actually.
Hello everyone, I'm going to shoot my gun.
He had posted this on the internet. This pistol fired blank rounds. He also showed off his knife, and he posed on Facebook with a knuckle duster. Damon Smith used an Al-Qaeda bomb-making manual to help him construct his device, but he denied he held extreme political views. He'll be sentenced later this month. June Kelly, BBC News.
Okay, so after the would-be attack, he ticked all the boxes. He had the Al-Qaeda bomb manual, he made a bomb, and they said, okay, here's another guy with autism. So, but when you look into the case, well, what's your impression? How does this differ from the first? Yeah, although there was some assumption he possessed IS material, which he got from the internet, but he used it because he had a fixated interest in making bombs. I mean, if he would have stuck to Star Wars or Train Spotting, you know, it would have been, but it was bombs. So he looked for ways to make a bomb, not to injure people, but he thought it was fantastic, you know, this big bang, that was his interest. And he had his autism was clinically manifest and related to his pathway to extremist violence in the sense that he had no idea what the consequences were of the explosion of his bomb. He literally said, you know, with a very strange non-verbal expression, I thought a good idea to leave my bag in the tube for a prank. Now, I mean, that's an unhealthy interpretation of what the bomb can do. But that's the way he is. He was not convicted for a terrorist crime. He was compulsory care. He went into compulsory care. So on the outside, it might look like terrorism, but it isn't terrorism. And if you and the idea is that, and these are two exceptional cases, but we should focus on how a person perceives the world around him and what the psychological needs are and how these psychological needs match with the psychological function of narratives in order to, in a preventive stage, because that was your question, try to look for alternatives which address the same underlying problem. And that's why it's important to ask the question, what motivates a terrorist or an extremist? So regarding the time, I'd like to leave it at this. Give some, maybe there's still some time for questions or discussion.
Yes, we do have.
Shall I stop sharing as we?
Yeah, maybe you want to switch back.
Yeah,
I
think we can keep it for now. So thank you. Yeah, we have some time for questions. I'll be taking them now.
I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, it was chilling to see that second paper, right? The first one definitely as well, but especially the supposed nonchalance, which I know is associated with him having Asperger's, but the way he spoke gave me personally good chills in listening to him, just for lack of a better expression. So, and it reminded me of a very stereotypical way in which like Bond villains or villains in media are portrayed. But to what extent do you think that media contributes to this stereotypical view of the association between clinical disorders leading towards violence and leading towards terrorism? Because I think something so chilling about someone being violent, but at the same time seeming childish, and that makes for very good scenes in cinema. But what role does the media play in this? Like,
well, I think, yeah, I think media, and not just media, but also the way we discuss things plays an important role. There's and the thing is, if we see something happen in our direct surroundings, which we do not immediately understand, we're inclined to attribute that to the psychological condition of the other person. Right. So if I leave here, the university, go home, and there's somebody in Central Station on his moving about on his hands and knees, my inclination will be to think this is, a weirdo. This guy is not well. Whereas if I ask him, what are you doing? He said, well, I've lost my contact lens, so I'm trying to keep my contact. It changes the context completely. So there's this attribution error, this fundamental attribution error, which contributes to the fact that psychiatric disorders are attributed to as a causal factor in terrorism. And that's also in the media. And also because it's easy. That's it. It was an autist, and not somebody with an autism spectrum disorder, autist. So I definitely think that the media contributes to that, losing all nuances of what's actually happened. Maybe I can give another example of this. There's I've got to deliver good. Hang on. No, it's not wrong. The instructions on there. I'll put your number. Yeah. I'll pick that later. So another example, which is a big problem at the moment, is that we see youngsters, 13, 14 years old, very active on the dark web, on sort of closed sites, groups, involved with extreme material, pornographic, violence, gore material. So it's gore plus plus. They're very young and they have terabytes of information on their devices. Because of the pornographic and the child pornographic content, they're sometimes arrested, and in the interviews they cannot explain what they're doing. So they have no idea. So the police officer will, well, what's the reason for you downloading all this material? No idea. Well, for example, I won't go into detail, but it's really extremely disgusting. And they say, well, I remember that. Yeah. What do you do with it? Well, I shared it. So sharing the material, which is extreme with an extremist content, may fulfill a need of being somebody. Whereas we shared the football pictures earlier on, and that was considered to be really a good guy if you had the picture which everybody wanted. Now it's extremist material. So on the outside, it looks like child porn, other violent content, but the actual function of what they're doing is different. It's harmful, by the way, because they're very young, and it's damaging.
To what extent does the political context matter? Because I'm thinking that youngsters who grow up right now in Gaza will have a reason to radicalize, and but also have probably a reason to get mad.
Sure. No, I think that the political context doesn't matter, but the fact that they are the third generation that's being bombed or evicted from their houses, that matters. Their basic security is damaged, and whether it's the politics or I think it's the existential risk which they face, which makes them prone to radicalize. We have the next generation of extremists with and I can't say you can't blame them, but it's certainly, you can understand how they perceive the world. So the political context, I don't think it's you see what I'm trying to, it's a bit wobbly, but what I'm trying to say, it's not the politics is the actual situation, which we may interpret as a political situation, but they, being bombed and surviving a bombardment, may not think of it as political, but they look for the perpetrators.
The political goal is understandable, and would you then call it terrorism or not?
Well, that is a good question. When do you call somebody an ally and when you call him an enemy? It depends on who wins. And there's a ridiculous conspiracy theory saying that the Second World War was started by Jewish bankers in America, because the Jewish bankers noticed that the Germans were better at the banking system and that they were losing money, so they started the Second World War. Now, this is a ridiculous conspiracy theory. I mean, and there are all sorts of, from their point of view, the Germans were not bad at all. And, well, so it depends on who wins, basically.
We do have one question.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi, is that for me?
Yeah,
Just to
that's
double
for
check.
you.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you for sharing everything that you have been sharing. I have to say, I also have a personal interest. I used to work at the NCTV, and I can remember many years ago a lot of discussions that probably would have gone a different way had we had your insights the way that you are sharing them now. But I wanted to sort of touch on something that was asked in the previous question and answer as well. Could you maybe share a little bit of your thoughts around propaganda and polarizing narratives that they're much slower in radicalizing people, especially also because they're often targeted at bigger groups rather than very activating or motivating for individuals. What are your thoughts on that in relation to what you've just shared about this?
Yeah, the propaganda, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it touches on the subject polarization, which is, of course, a very much intertwined with radicalization and extremism. So polarization, the polarization lab is across the Atlantic Ocean, and there we see that polarization, which as such doesn't need to be problematic, has turned into effective polarization. And effective polarization, maybe you're familiar with the term, but effective polarization means that there's no discussion possible anymore. So if I identify you as the other side, the outgroup, I will not discuss anything. Well, I'm not open to comments. I'm not open to suggestions. That it frustrates the debate. And I think that the propaganda and the active polarization, which we also see in the Netherlands with for example, Forum for Democratie, it's funnily enough called, that in Parliament, that form of propaganda, talking about tribunals and moves the Overton window, in other words, the window which is acceptable, further to the extremes, and things which had been inconceivable 20 years ago, subjects which were not talked about or not done, are now discussed openly. So I think propaganda as an active form of polarization has definitely got to do with radicalization, certainly. And thank you for your comments about the NSTV. There's still a lot of work to do, but they are paying me, so
they've made some great progress. It's also interesting to see my old boss in his new position, but that's for another time.
Your old boss. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Dick Schoof, yes.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Right. You're welcome. Okay, well, it's 4.
Yeah.
So I think, as you have an appointment, you have to go. I have to go myself as well. Okay. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for the opportunity of sharing some thoughts with you. Thank you for the questions, and have a good weekend.